What if the thing you have been searching for in the world has never been outside of you at all, never waiting in people, in timing, in circumstances, but has always been seated in silence within your own being, dreaming this life through you, shaping it through you, and waiting only for your recognition? Because that is the real shock of all spiritual truth. Not that God is great, not that the universe is mysterious, but that the creative power sustaining all things is personal, intimate, immediate, and residing in you now as your own wonderful human imagination. Most people are trained to think of power as external, to kneel before something outside themselves, to ask life for permission, to wait for signs, to hope that some force beyond them will finally move on their behalf. But what if that whole structure of waiting is the very thing that keeps them blind to what has already been given? Because if the power is within, then the issue is never whether it exists, the issue is whether you will use it. So again, quietly, what would imply that your desire were already fulfilled? Not someday, not eventually, but now. Because the secret is always implication. If you desired marriage, what would imply that it is already so? Not a sermon, not a public announcement, not an explanation to the world, but the simplest sign that would naturally belong to the fulfilled state. A ring, a touch, a feeling, a quiet inner fact. And if you can feel that inner fact as real, then you have already entered the state from which its outer expression must come. This is why imagination is so much more than visualization. It is sensory participation in an unseen reality until that unseen reality begins to feel more natural than the absence of it. If you can inwardly feel silk, silver, a ball, a ring, and know the difference between them without using your physical senses, then you are already proving something immense to yourself, that the unseen is not unreal. It exists. It has texture, tone, identity, meaning. And once you accept that, the whole argument against imagination begins to collapse. Because now you know that what is not visible can still be real. And if it can be real, it can be entered. And if it can be entered, it can become fact. That is the law. Not theory, not poetry, law. So the question becomes far more direct. Can you feel the state of the wish fulfilled without demanding that the outer world first approve it? Can you wear inwardly what you have not yet worn outwardly? Can you accept the dignity, relief, joy, completion, or intimacy of a desired state before the senses confirm it? Because that is where the whole creative process begins. Not with effort, not with searching, but with assumption. An assumption is not wishing. Assumption is occupancy. It is the quiet inward acceptance that this is now true of me. And once a state is accepted that way, the world begins to respond. Not always loudly, not always instantly, but inevitably. This is why the desperate search for love so often fails. Because searching announces absence. And absence can only reproduce itself. Those who go looking frantically for the one are usually moving from lovelessness, from the feeling that something is missing, from the belief that fulfillment is outside them, and therefore every search only reinforces the state of not having. But the loving do not seek love in that way. They radiate it, they occupy it, they become it. And because they become it, life must answer. So if you desire union, do not begin with pursuit. Begin with embodiment. Feel the state in which you are already chosen, already loved, already joined, and let that be your dwelling place. The outer event will come. It will emerge in a way that feels natural, almost inevitable, almost as though it had been forming all along, because in truth it has. The imaginal act is always first. The visible event is always later. And this is why you must stop treating imagination as fantasy and start treating it as causation. What you dare to feel inwardly as true becomes the mold from which life takes shape. What you secretly consent to becomes the pattern through which events arrange themselves. And beneath all of this, deeper than every lesser desire, deeper than every attempt to improve life, there remains a more astonishing truth still. The one who imagines is not merely a human faculty reaching upward, but God himself dreaming within man. The meditation at the center of your being is not metaphor. It is the hidden fact of existence. There is something in you deeper than thought, deeper than personality, deeper than all the changing roles you play, and that being is the dreamer of your life. It allows you to wander, to choose, to fail, to learn, to distort, to create beauty, to create confusion, to make monsters, to make miracles, and all of it unfolds within the great mystery of its own self-concealment. And when it wakes fully in you, you will know that it was never other than yourself. That is why imagination is not just a way to get things. It is the path by which the dreamer awakens inside the dream. So yes, begin simply. Begin tonight. Begin with something natural, lovely, intimate, specific. Let the sign imply the fulfilled desire. Feel it, accept it, sleep in it, and do not ask the world for permission to believe what you have inwardly touched, because the moment you truly touch it within, the process has begun. And if you remain faithful to that inner fact, you will discover for yourself what no argument can give you, that the power which created and sustains the universe is within you, personal, immediate, and waiting only for belief made, living through assumption. And once you begin to accept that the imaginal act is not make-believe, but the very mold from which reality is cast, something within you starts to reorder itself, because you are no longer living as one who waits for proof. You are beginning to live as one who gives proof its cause. This is the turning point that most people miss. They hear that imagination creates reality, they feel inspired by it, but then they quietly return to the old habit of consulting appearances before they dare believe. And by doing so, they hand authority back to the senses, but the senses are always late. They report what has already been accepted, never what is now being chosen. So again, quietly, do you need the world to confirm your state? Or can you let your state become the thing that confirms the world? Because that distinction is the whole art. The one who still waits for outer permission cannot remain faithful to an inner act for very long, because every delay feels like contradiction. Every silence feels like denial. Every absence feels like proof that nothing is happening. But the one who understands the law knows that absence is not emptiness, it is gestation. The unseen is not nothing, it is the real beginning. The seed is not false because it has not yet broken the surface. It is simply hidden in the process of becoming visible. And this is why the imaginal act must be entered with feeling and then left alone. Not abandoned, but not disturbed. Not forgotten, but not nervously handled. Because once you have accepted the state as real, your work is no longer to create it again. Your work is to stop contradicting it. This is where most desires fail. Not in the moment of imagining, but in the hours after, when the mind begins its old argument, when the senses say nothing has changed, when the memory of the former state returns and claims authority, then comes the real test. Will you remain inwardly loyal to what you have touched, or will you return to the evidence of what has not yet caught up? If you return, you step out of the state. If you remain, the state begins to take on the weight of truth. And that truth does not need to shout. It does not need emotional intensity. It needs naturalness. That is why the fulfilled state is often quieter than people expect. It is not dramatic. It is settled. The loving do not strive to be loved every moment. The married do not keep proving they are married every hour. The secure do not constantly rehearse security. The fulfilled do not speak like beggars. They live from a tone, an assumption, an inward resting place that feels ordinary to them because it has become self. And that is where you are going whenever you imagine rightly, not toward excitement, but toward naturalness. So the question sharpens. What would feel normal to you if the desire were already fulfilled. Not what would impress others, not what would produce the most spectacle, but what would feel inwardly settled, inwardly done, inwardly real. Because the law does not answer to your performance, it answers to your acceptance. Once something is accepted as true in consciousness, life begins the quiet work of arranging itself around that acceptance. And the ways it does so are almost always beyond the reasoning mind. That is why you must resist the temptation to outline the path, to calculate the bridge, to dictate the means. The deeper being within you knows how to externalize what the surface self cannot possibly organize. Your part is the state. The how belongs to a wisdom deeper than thought. This is why searching is so often the sign of unbelief. It is not action itself that is wrong, but action taken from emptiness, from craving, from inner separation. The one who acts from lack keeps extending lack. The one who acts from the fulfilled state moves differently, speaks differently, notices different openings, and often finds that the world begins to cooperate without strain. So you must be careful not to confuse natural movement with anxious searching. The search for love from lovelessness only makes lovelessness visible. The search for security from fear only multiplies fear. The attempt to be chosen while feeling inwardly rejected only repeats rejection. But the moment you become inwardly the thing desired, the outer world begins to answer, not because it is being manipulated, but because it is reflecting. This is why you do not need to chase the right people, force the right conversations, or bend life into shape by sheer will. The state, once entered, starts drawing to itself its own expression. That is the secret behind so many so-called coincidences. What appears accidental from the outside is often lawful from within. The imaginal act has its own appointment, its own rhythm, its own season, and if you can trust that, really trust it, a deep relief begins to replace mental strain. You no longer feel responsible for making every detail happen. You feel responsible only for remaining inwardly true, and that is a completely different way of living. It is calmer but stronger, more relaxed but more exact, less controlling but far more creative. Because now you know that what you do in imagination is not decorative, it is causative. And once that becomes real to you, even in one small area of life, you will never again be able to dismiss your inward acts as just thoughts. You will know better. You will know that the imaginal act, once felt and accepted, has begun to move the world. And when you begin to trust the imaginal act enough not to disturb it, not to drag it back into the court of appearances for judgment, not to ask the senses for permission to continue believing, something even deeper begins to unfold within you. And that is a discovery that your relationship to desire itself starts to change. Because at first most people imagine from hunger, from urgency, from the aching sense that something is missing. And so even while they are trying to use the law, they are still speaking the language of absence, still identifying with the state of not having, still inwardly waiting. But the moment the imaginal act is truly entered, the moment the desired end is accepted as inwardly real, desire ceases to feel like longing and begins to feel like possession. Not visible possession yet perhaps, but inward possession, and inward possession is the beginning of all outer fact. So again quietly, are you still wanting it, or have you begun to feel that it is already yours? Because this is the most delicate and decisive shift of all. Wanting still says not yet. Wanting still says somewhere ahead. Wanting still keeps the thing outside the circle of self. But acceptance draws it inward. Acceptance says, this belongs to me now in consciousness. And once something belongs to you there, the outer world is only the slow announcement of what has already been decided. This is why the law does not ask you merely to think about a result, but to feel the reality of it, to wear it inwardly, to consent to its naturalness until the state itself begins to feel more intimate than the old one. And this is where many retreat, because they do not realize that imagination asks for inner courage, not just technique. It asks you to stop defining yourself by visible circumstances and to begin defining yourself by an unseen assumption. That sounds simple, but it threatens everything in you that has been trained to call facts final. It threatens the old identity that says, I will believe when I see. It threatens the old habit of emotional dependence upon appearances. It threatens the whole structure of waiting. And yet that threat is actually liberation, because until the old structure is shaken, you remain its prisoner. So the question sharpens. What part of you still feels safer believing appearances than trusting your own inner act? Because that is the point where faith must deepen. Not shallow optimism, not emotional hype. Faith as inner loyalty to a reality that has not yet broken the surface. Faith as the willingness to continue inhabiting a state even while the senses report the former one. Faith as the refusal to say it is not here simply because it is not yet seen. Once you begin to live from that kind of faith, a strange peace enters, not always immediately, but unmistakably. The urgency softens. The pressure dissolves. The frantic need to monitor progress begins to fade. Why? Because inwardly you are no longer a seeker. You are becoming the possessor of the state. And possession changes the whole tone of consciousness. The unmarried woman who inwardly accepts herself as chosen no longer carries the same atmosphere as one who feels abandoned. The man who inwardly accepts himself as secure no longer moves through the world with the same tension as one who feels exposed. The one who has inwardly entered a state begins to think from it, react from it, notice from it, and even when the outer facts lag behind, the inner arrangement has already altered the person. This is the hidden miracle of the law. The imaginal act first changes the imaginer, and because it changes the imaginer, the world which reflects the imaginer must then begin to change also. So you must not underestimate what happens in the silence of a true assumption. The world may call it nothing. The senses may call it not yet. But consciousness knows better. Consciousness knows when a thing has been accepted. Consciousness knows when an old identity has been displaced. Consciousness knows when you have actually moved. And when that movement is real, the outer world is already under command, whether it appears so or not. This is why the state fulfilled must be returned to again and again, not from desperation, but from devotion, not to force it into being, but to let it become natural. Because whatever becomes natural becomes self, and whatever becomes self becomes law to your experience. If the state still feels foreign, visit it. If it still feels fragile, clothe yourself in it again. If it still feels unreal, return quietly and feel its texture more deeply. Not as strain, but as cultivation. Not as begging, but as familiarization. Until one day the desired state no longer feels like something you are doing and becomes something you are. And that is when the bridge of incidents begins to form with a kind of inevitability that often surprises the surface mind. The right encounter appears. The unforeseen opening comes. The word is spoken. The barrier moves. The impossible rearranges itself in the most natural way imaginable. And people looking on will say it happened by chance, by timing, by personality, by luck, by some chain of ordinary causes. But you will know where it truly began. It began in the moment you stopped wanting and started being. It began in the inward consent that what you desired was already accepted in the only place that matters first. And from that point on, the world was always going to follow. And this is where the true discipline begins. Not in forming the imaginal act, not in touching the feeling once, but in remaining loyal to it when the visible world seems to deny it, because the moment the state is inwardly accepted, the old world does not always vanish at once. It often continues for a while, like an echo from a sound that has already been made. And if you do not understand that, you will think nothing is happening when in fact everything has already begun. So again, quietly, when the outer world contradicts your assumption, which one do you call real? Because that answer reveals whether you are still serving appearances or whether you have truly begun to live from imagination. Most people imagine a better state for a moment, and then the instant the senses report the old condition, they surrender, they return emotionally to the visible, and in doing so they re-enter the very state they were trying to leave. It is not that the law failed. It is that they abandoned the state before it became natural. They visited the end, but they did not live there. And this is why faith is not merely believing once, it is fidelity to the unseen while the seen is still catching up. It is the willingness to remain inwardly where you have moved yourself, even when the world continues to show the last residue of where you used to be. If you can do that, something powerful happens. The senses begin to lose their tyranny. They are still there, yes, but they no longer define you. They report conditions, but they do not dictate identity. They show you what has been, but they do not get to decide what will be. And that is a profound reversal, because most people have been trained to derive identity from circumstance. If the money is not there, they say, I am poor. If the relationship is absent, they say, I am alone. If the opportunity has not appeared, they say, I am blocked. But the imaginal life teaches something entirely different. It teaches that you do not wait for condition to declare identity. You assume identity and let condition follow. So the question sharpens. Are you still allowing facts to name you, or are you now naming the facts from the state you have chosen? Because the one who allows appearances to name him remains their servant, but the one who names from within begins to discover what creative authority actually means. Not arrogance, not control in the worldly sense, but inward precedence, the state first, the reflection after. And once you understand that order, persistence stops feeling like strain and begins to feel like coherence. You are simply refusing to contradict what you have already accepted as true in consciousness. You are not trying to make yourself believe. You are protecting the imaginal act from being undone by the old habit of reacting to surface evidence. This is why sleep is so often emphasized. Because when you fall asleep in the feeling of the wish fulfilled, you are not merely comforting yourself, you are impressing the deeper self with the accepted state, and the deeper self does not argue the way the surface mind does. It receives, it embodies, it externalizes. So if you repeatedly return to the fulfilled end, not with anxiety but with quiet acceptance, the state begins to harden into reality, not because some outside power rewards you for believing, but because the outside was never outside in the first place. It is the extension of what has been accepted within. This is the real meaning of faithfulness. Not moral rigidity, not emotional stubbornness, but imaginal consistency. The old man says, look, nothing has changed. The new man says, it is already done. The old man looks to the senses for orders. The new man gives the senses time to catch up. The old man asks, where is it? The new man asks, nothing. Because inwardly, he has already entered the state in which the answer exists. And that is why you must stop measuring progress by appearances alone. The root grows before the branch is seen. The pregnancy exists before the child is born. The seed is alive before the field reveals it. Every imaginal act has its own appointed hour, and that hour is not delayed, because you do not yet see movement. It is simply ripening in a dimension the senses do not yet register. If you understand this, patience ceases to be passive waiting and becomes intelligent trust. You do not disturb the seed. You do not dig at the root. You do not keep asking the law to prove itself every morning. You remain where you move yourself in imagination and let the world do what it must do next. And if you remain there long enough, lovingly enough, naturally enough, something extraordinary takes place. The fulfilled state stops feeling like an act and begins to feel like home. Once that happens, the bridge of events can no longer be stopped, because the outer world is now serving a settled inner arrangement. And that is why the difference between success and failure in this law is rarely imagination itself. It is loyalty. Loyalty to the state after the imaginal act. Loyalty to the unseen while the seen still argues. Loyalty to the inward truth before it has become public fact. And the one who learns that no longer lives as a victim of changing appearances. He lives as the chooser of states, the occupier of ends, the one who knows that if he can remain inwardly faithful, the world must in time become outwardly obedient. And when you begin to understand loyalty to the unseen as the true discipline of creation, another realization starts to unfold, and it is one of the most important of all. You do not need to know how the thing will happen. You only need to know what it would feel like were it already so. Because the moment you start outlining means, predicting channels, calculating routes, or deciding which person must do what, you quietly step out of the state of fulfillment and back into the state of effort. And effort always reveals that the end has not yet been accepted. So again, quietly, are you dwelling in the end, or are you trying to manage the middle? Because the middle belongs to the bridge of incidents, and the bridge is not your task. The bridge forms out of the accepted state. It arranges itself from depths the surface mind cannot map. This is why so much of manifestation appears ordinary after it happens. People will point to conversations, opportunities, coincidences, sudden changes of heart, delayed answers, unexpected meetings, and they will say, well, that's how it happened. But they will not see that those visible steps were only the outer garments of an imaginal command already accepted within. The event always looks natural once it arrives. It rarely announces itself as miracle. It often hides itself inside sequence. But sequence is not cause. State is cause. And this is why you must learn to stop worshipping the channel through which the thing comes. You do not need to identify the person, the company, the date, the road, the technique, or the circumstance. You need only enter the state in which the desire is already a fact. Because once you do, life begins to reorganize itself from that level outward. This is where the reasoning mind becomes both useful and dangerous. Useful when it serves daily function. Dangerous when it tries to become architect of fulfillment. The surface mind does not know enough. It sees fragments and calls them totality. It sees delay and calls it denial. It sees one closed door and imagines there are no others. But the deeper self, the dreamer within, the one who meditates you into experience, knows paths beyond your little calculations. It knows how to disentangle what seems impossible, how to open what seems fixed, how to route you through events you could not have designed for yourself. So the real maturity of imagination begins when you stop insisting that the law obey your preferred route, and instead allow the accepted end to select its own means. That is trust. Not passivity, not laziness, not refusing movement when movement comes naturally, but the surrender of control over the unseen mechanics of fulfillment. And that surrender is powerful because it frees you from the anxiety of orchestration. You are no longer watching people like chess pieces. You are no longer asking whether this one matters or that one matters, whether you missed your chance, whether something has gone wrong, whether the delay has ruined everything. Those questions belong to the old state, the state that still believes it must engineer the outcome. But the fulfilled state does not think that way. The fulfilled state rests. It may act, yes, but it acts naturally, not neurotically. It moves when moved. It responds when response is right. It does not scramble. It does not clutch. It does not chase the means, because it is identified with the end. So the question sharpens now. If the desire were already fulfilled, would you still be so anxious about how it must arrive? Because anxiety about the route is often only hidden disbelief about the destination. It is the mind's way of confessing, I do not yet feel secure in the state, so I need to control the path. But once the state is secure, the path loses its obsession. You become more available to inspired action because you are no longer acting from fear. You become more observant because you are no longer blinded by urgency. You become more magnetic because you are no longer inwardly grasping. All of this happens not because you try to improve your personality, but because the accepted state is already shaping the one who dwells in it. That is why the law is so elegant. It changes the inner man first, and the changed inner man then walks across a world that must respond differently to him. Not because he forced people to comply, but because his whole relation to life has shifted. He notices what he once missed. He says what he once feared. He carries the atmosphere of possession rather than lack. An atmosphere matters more than most people know. The world is exquisitely responsive to atmosphere because atmosphere is the emotional signature of state. One who feels chosen moves differently from one who feels forgotten. One who feels secure hears differently from one who feels threatened. One who feels already established no longer performs the desperation that repels the very thing desired. So when you dwell in the end, you are not merely preparing a future event. You are becoming the sort of being to whom that event belongs naturally. And that is why the world eventually yields. It is not being bullied. It is being matched. This is also why you must stop talking yourself out of fulfilled states by invoking the evidence of the past. But this has happened before. But they always do this. But I know how these things go. These are not insights. They are old states quoting themselves. They are yesterday trying to preserve its throne. And if you let them speak as truth, you return to them. But if you can hear them as mere echoes of former occupancy, you remain free. You remain loyal to the new end. You remain inwardly where the fulfilled self lives. And from there, slowly or suddenly, softly or dramatically, the bridge begins to reveal itself. A call comes, a meeting occurs, a shift happens, a dead situation moves, a possibility appears where none seem to exist. And though the surface mind may still try to reduce it to sequence, something in you knows better. You know that the real event happened earlier in silence, when you accepted the end and stopped trying to micromanage the road. And when you finally stop trying to manage the bridge and allow the accepted end to generate its own way, something even deeper becomes possible. Something far greater than getting a single desire fulfilled, because now you begin to understand the real nature of the power operating within you. And that power is not a technique, not a method, not a clever psychological trick, but the very being of God, individualized as your own wonderful human imagination. This is where the teaching becomes almost too immense for the surface mind, because the surface mind still wants a manageable law, something it can use without being changed by it, something it can practice without surrendering its old self-concept. But the deeper truth does not permit that comfort. If imagination is truly the creative power of the universe, then you are not merely using God as though he were a tool in your hand. You are discovering that the one who imagines is the very presence of God within man, personal, immediate, hidden, dreaming this life from within your own being. So again, quietly, what if the one within you who forms images, accepts states, and gives emotional reality to the unseen is not a lesser faculty, but the very source of all creation? Because you stop treating inner acts as though they were harmless little fantasies. You stop thinking your secret assumptions are private and without consequence. You realize that every imaginal act is participation in the one power that creates worlds, and that realization changes not only what you do, but how reverently you do it. This is why the old idea of an external God must eventually break down, not because devotion is wrong, but because the object of devotion was misunderstood. Men have knelt before powers outside themselves, praised gods in the distance, begged heaven to move, and all the while the very one to whom they prayed was seated within them, meditating them into experience, bearing their life from within, allowing their mistakes, their triumphs, their confusions, and their discoveries as part of a deeper unfolding toward awakening. This is why the law is so intimate. You do not call across space to some absent being. You turn inward to the one who is nearer than thought, nearer than breath, nearer than your own sense of personality, because that one is your own reality. The dreamer within you is dreaming this section of life, and when he fully awakes, this whole arrangement of limitation ceases as dream, and you know yourself as he. Until then, you are invited to use the same power on the level where you now stand to imagine noble states, loving states, freeing states, healing states, dignified states, and by doing so to participate consciously in the very movement by which God awakens within man. That is why no imaginal act is trivial. Every one of them either cooperates with awakening or extends the sleep. Every one either moves you into greater dignity or deeper confusion. Every one either expresses love or reinforces fear. And because that is true, imagination becomes not only creative but moral in the deeper sense. Not morality imposed from outside, but the natural morality of understanding what you are handling. You are handling creative substance. You are handling the coin of heaven in another form. You are handling the faculty by which states are selected, embodied, and eventually externalized. So if you use it carelessly, you suffer the fruits of carelessness. If you use it lovingly, you reap the fruits of love. Not because you are being judged from outside, but because consciousness is self-executing. It takes the impression and makes the world answer to it. This is why the wise become more and more inwardly selective, not fearful, not cramped, but clear. They do not let every rumor become a prophecy, every anxiety become a future, every resentment become an identity, because they know the cost of inward consent, and they do not despise this responsibility, because with responsibility comes glory. If the creative power is truly within you, then you are not condemned to repeat your life unconsciously forever. You can become deliberate. You can choose states knowingly. You can imagine for another with love. You can imagine for yourself with dignity. You can stop asking the world to change first and begin the change where all things actually begin. And this is why the law, once truly understood, becomes not a burden but a liberation. You no longer have to wait for external permission. You no longer have to be chosen by some outside force. You no longer have to live in fear that life is arbitrary. You begin to understand that the universe is intimate, responsive, alive within you, and that its deepest creative center is not somewhere beyond reach, but present in the one who says, I am. So the question sharpens now. If this power is really within you, if the dreamer of your life is not separate from your own being, then what are you willing to imagine from now on? And what are you no longer willing to consent to? Because from this point forward, ignorance becomes harder. You know too much now to keep calling your inner acts insignificant. You know too much now to keep blaming appearances as though they were cause. You know too much now to keep worshiping conditions while ignoring the consciousness that formed them. The great shift is already happening. The moment you recognize this, the same power that sustains the universe is resident in you, personal, creative, immediate, and waiting not for your flattery, but for your use. And if you begin to use it faithfully, lovingly, and deliberately, then desire by desire, state by state, assumption by assumption, you will discover not only that imagination creates reality, but that reality itself is the outpicturing of a divine being who became you, that you might one day awaken as him. And when you begin to realize that the power within you is not symbolic but actual, not poetic but operative, not something to admire from a distance, but something to exercise deliberately, another profound change begins to take place. And this time it is not merely in what you desire or how you imagine, but in the way you begin to carry yourself through the world. Because you can no longer honestly think of yourself as a victim of conditions Once you know the conditions are only the outpicturing of states, and states are selected inwardly through imagination. This does not make you arrogant, it makes you responsible. It does not make you cold, it makes you exact. It does not make you grand in the foolish worldly sense. It makes you inwardly serious, because now you understand that every reaction, every assumption, every secret consent of the heart is part of the shaping of experience. And once that becomes real to you, you stop living carelessly in your own mind. So again, quietly, if your imagination is the indwelling creative power, why keep handing your inner world over to fear, resentment, self-pity, delay, or appearances? Why keep decorating the old prison and calling it realism? Why keep returning to states that have already shown you their fruit? Because at some point the awakened soul grows tired, not of life, but of unconscious repetition. It grows tired of calling the same pain by different names. It grows tired of letting the senses dictate the structure of identity. It grows tired of pretending that circumstances are sovereign, when it has already seen, even once, that imagination precedes fact. And that weariness becomes holy when it turns into decision. Because then you begin to say inwardly, enough, I will no longer permit passing states to define the eternal being that I am. This is where inner dignity is born. Not from applause, not from success alone, not from getting what you want quickly, but from the recognition that your real background is not social, not historical, not biological, but divine. The one within you who imagines is not a little faculty trying to rise above circumstance. The one within you is the very creative reality of the world. And if that is true, then self-respect ceases to be a psychological slogan and becomes a spiritual necessity. You begin to treat your own inner life differently. You do not casually imagine the worst and call it caution. You do not rehearse humiliation and call it humility. You do not consent to inner defeat and call it honesty. You begin instead to select with reverence, to assume with dignity, to feel with care, because you know what these inward movements become. You know they are not lost. You know they are not harmless. You know they are seeds. And once you know that, your whole relation to the world changes. You can walk through situations that once intimidated you and remain inwardly free because you're no longer deriving your value from what the world thinks it sees. You can meet arrogance without bowing to it, wealth without worshiping it, success without envying it, failure without collapsing before it, because you have learned a great distinction. No state, however glittering or humiliating, is the essence of the individual wearing it. This is why true spiritual aristocracy has nothing to do with ancestry, status, title, class, reputation, race, or worldly pedigree. All of that belongs to the dream and shifts with the states of men. The only true nobility is the nobility of awakened consciousness, the dignity of one who knows the source of creation is within, the authority of one who no longer looks to appearances for permission to be what he has inwardly accepted. And when that begins to stabilize, something remarkable happens. You stop trying so hard to impress life. You stop trying to prove yourself into being. You stop chasing validation as though it were oxygen. Because inwardly you have touched something greater than praise and deeper than public success. You have touched the knowledge that imagination is the root and the world is the fruit. And once that order is seen, a strange calm enters the soul. You no longer need to rush. You no longer need to grasp. You no longer need to force. You become capable of a new kind of movement, one that is natural but not passive, selective but not strained, faithful but not frantic. And this is what real power looks like in practice. It is not noisy. It is not theatrical. It does not announce itself every hour. It simply remains true inwardly until the world has no choice but to echo it. So the question sharpens again. What kind of inner atmosphere are you willing to call home from now on? Because atmosphere is not decoration. atmosphere is identity in emotional form. The one who inwardly feels chosen walks differently from the one who feels forgotten. The one who inwardly feels secure hears differently from the one who feels threatened. The one who inwardly accepts dignity stops bargaining with environments that feed on self-doubt. And all of this begins before one outward fact changes, because identity always shifts before evidence does. That is why the faithful imaginer can seem almost unreasonable to the surface mind. He is living from an order deeper than visible proof. He is not insane. He is simply refusing to let the tail lead the head. He knows the state first, the world second. He knows the imaginal act first, the visible consequence second. He knows the seed first, the harvest second. And once this order is inwardly accepted, a man becomes difficult to intimidate, not because he is stubborn, but because he is rooted. He has ceased to float on the changing winds of circumstance. He has found the center. He has remembered the source. And this is where the whole journey begins to take on a new radiance, because now each desire, each challenge, each encounter becomes an opportunity, not merely to get something from life, but to prove again the nature of the indwelling power. You begin to live experimentally, deliberately, lovingly. You imagine for others because you know they are not the state they occupy. You imagine for yourself because you know you are not bound to the room you are presently in. You forgive more easily because you see the difference between the being and the condition. You persist more naturally because you know appearances lag behind assumption. You become inwardly bold because you know the law is real. And from that point on, life is no longer a random procession of events happening to an exposed self. It becomes the schooling ground of the awakened imaginer, the place where God in man learns to handle his own nature consciously, lovingly, and with authority. And when you begin to live from that center, when you no longer hand your identity over to passing conditions, when you finally stop asking appearances to tell you what is true about you, something irreversible begins to happen. And it is not merely that life improves, but that your whole relationship to reality changes at its root, because you no longer stand before the world as a beggar asking for permission. You stand within it as the one through whom meaning, assumption, and form are being generated. This is the great awakening hidden behind every lesser desire, behind every imaginal act, behind every state you enter and leave, that the being moving through the states is greater than them all, older than them all, and destined not to be absorbed into nothingness, but to awaken in full self-knowledge as the very Lord of the drama. So again, quietly, what if the whole journey was never about getting things from life, but about discovering who is dreaming life from within you? Because once that question becomes real, even your desires begin to change their tone. You may still desire love, security, health, freedom, recognition, beauty, companionship, meaningful work, and all of these remain natural, lawful, and good, but beneath them you begin to feel something deeper. The movement of consciousness toward its own remembrance, the gradual unveiling of the one who entered limitation willingly and now rises through experience into self-recognition. This is why Scripture cannot be reduced to history, why its characters cannot be imprisoned inside time, why its events refuse to remain merely literal. They are disclosures of an eternal drama taking place in the depths of man. And when you see that, the whole book becomes alive, immediate, intimate, and inward. Then Abraham is not someone you read about, but a state through which you pass. David is not merely a name, but the eternal Son revealed at the end. Jesus is not an external Savior coming from the skies, but the fulfilled and awakened state in which the dreamer knows himself completely. And God is no longer a distant object of theology, but the reality of your own wonderful human imagination, dreaming, selecting, revealing, and ultimately awakening as you. This is why imagination can never again be treated as trivial once it is understood. It is not a trick to improve circumstances, though it will improve them. It is not a decorative mystical idea, though it may sound mystical. It is the living center of creation, the faculty through which states are entered, worlds are formed, men are redeemed, and the divine is made manifest in the individual. And that means everything matters now in a new way. Every inner conversation, every silent reaction, every assumption about yourself or another, every consent to fear or consent to freedom, every moment in which you call a state by the name of self or refuse to do so. Because the awakened life is not careless. It is not frightened either, but it is exact. It knows the cost of dwelling in what is unlovely. It knows the fruit of inward fidelity. It knows that every imaginal act is a seed, and every seed has its appointed hour. It knows that no state is permanent for the individual unless he keeps returning to it. It knows that no person is reducible to the state he occupies. It knows that forgiveness is possible because identity is deeper than condition. It knows that death cannot be the end because the one who imagines cannot die. And once these things become living knowledge rather than borrowed ideas, you stop moving through life as a victim of events and begin moving through it as an immortal selector of states. One who can bless, lift, revise, redeem, and persist without having to wait for outer approval. This does not make you proud in the vulgar sense. It makes you inwardly free. It does not separate you from others. It deepens compassion, because now you see everyone as the immortal being passing through states, sometimes glorious, sometimes terrible, sometimes noble, sometimes confused, but never finally reducible to any of them. And that changes the whole emotional atmosphere of life. You no longer need to hate the fallen state in order to leave it. You no longer need to worship the exalted state in order to enter it. You no longer need to condemn the individual for the room he has wandered into. You can simply know this too is a state, and states can be changed. This too is an appearance, and appearances are not ultimate. This too is part of the journey, and the journey ends not in annihilation, not in loss of identity, but in awakening. So the final question becomes not, can imagination really create reality? But am I willing to live as though that were true in every area of life? Because the law is not proven once and forgotten. It is lived, tested, deepened, refined, and finally embodied. And the more it is embodied, the more natural it becomes to refuse fear, refuse unworthiness, refuse inherited limitation, refuse second-hand definitions of self, and instead stand inwardly as one whose root is divine. Not because you are pretending to be greater than man, but because God actually became man, that man might awaken as God. And that awakening is the secret center of everything. So now the whole message becomes beautifully simple. Even if it takes a lifetime to fully realize, do not mistake the state for the self. Do not surrender your identity to appearances. Do not let delay talk you out of law. Do not call a temporary room your eternal name. Do not waste the coin of heaven in careless thought. Do not kneel before conditions. Do not seek outside what is dreaming within. And above all, do not forget that the one who says, I am in you, is the only creative power there is. Walk from that. Imagine from that. Love from that. Choose from that. Persist from that. And when you finally do, when you no longer divide yourself from the source, when you no longer worship the shadow more than the dreamer, when you stop waiting for the world to tell you who you are, you will discover the great truth hidden behind every state and every scripture and every longing of the heart. You were never merely passing through life. Life was the passage through which God in you was awakening to himself.